I had been working as a licensed land surveyor in western Montana for 11 years when a timber company hired my crew to remark a section of boundary line between their holdings and a decommissioned parcel of the Lolo National Forest. The contract came through Ridgeline Forestry, a mid-size outfit that had acquired roughly 14,000 acres of former Plum Creek land in Mineral County during a sell-off in 2014. Most of their parcels sat in the classic checkerboard, alternating private and federal sections left over from the Northern Pacific Railroad grants of the 1860s. And boundary work on checkerboard land was steady money for a small surveying firm. I'd done similar jobs a dozen times. What made this one different was a road that shouldn't have existed. If you've spent any time following these kinds of stories, real investigations in real wilderness, things that actually happened and still don't entirely make sense, then you already know what this channel is about. Ashwarden Horror is where I've been sharing these accounts. And if that kind of careful, honest documentation matters to you, I'd encourage you to subscribe and stay with us. What I'm going to describe happened over 7 weeks in the winter and early spring of 2025. And I still drive past the turnoff every time I'm on Highway 200 without stopping. The contract specified remonumenting the boundary between sections 14 and 15 in Township 18 North, Range 28 West, which placed us about 9 miles north of the town of Superior in the drainage of Trout Creek. Ridgeline's forester, a woman named Dana Kowalski, explained the situation in a phone call that November. The company was preparing a timber sale on their Section 14 holdings, and the original boundary markers, mostly old General Land Office brass caps, and a few BLM aluminum monuments from a 1978 resurvey, hadn't been verified since Plum Creek owned the land. Some of the GLO caps dated to 1898. In timbered, mountainous terrain, 127 years of frost heave, erosion, and root growth could move a monument far enough from its original position to create real legal problems during a harvest. Dana wanted the line walked, the monuments verified or reset, and any discrepancies documented before the sale went forward. Standard work. My crew at the time was myself and 2 others. Garrett Hess, a survey technician who'd been with me for 4 years, and Carmen Reyes, a newer hire who'd come over from a civil engineering firm in Missoula. We planned to begin in early January, which might sound counterintuitive for fieldwork in the Northern Rockies. But winter surveying has advantages in heavy timber. The underbrush is buried, the canopy is thinner, and GPS signal penetration through bare deciduous branches is significantly better than in summer. Mineral County averages over 60 inches of snow in a season, and the mountains above the Clark Fork drainage can triple that. But the valley bottoms along Trout Creek stay manageable through January if you're equipped for it. We drove out on January 6th. Highway 200 follows the Clark Fork River west through Superior. And about 3 miles past town, Trout Creek Road climbs north into the drainage. The county maintains it as far as a cluster of rural properties near the creek's lower fork, roughly 5 miles up. Beyond that, a Forest Service road designated FR 362 continues another 7 miles through a mix of federal and ridgeline land to reach the general area of our work. FR 362 had been maintained as a Level 3 road through the early 1990s, adequate for passenger vehicles during dry months. But in 1997, the Forest Service had downgraded it and formally decommissioned the upper 4 miles as part of a larger road reduction program across the Lolo. Dana had already confirmed that Ridgeline held an easement for access across the lower, undecommissioned portion and a special use permit for vehicle access along the decommissioned upper stretch during active land management operations, which our boundary survey qualified as. The decommissioning of that upper 4 miles was supposed to have been thorough. I'd reviewed the 1997 project documentation that Dana had pulled from the Forest Service. The work order specified removal of 3 culverts at stream crossings, construction of water bars at 40-foot intervals on slopes exceeding 6%, placement of an earthen berm at the transition point between the maintained and decommissioned sections, and scarification of the road surface to promote natural revegetation. Standard practice for the era. The intent was to render the road impassable to ordinary vehicles and allow the corridor to begin reverting to a natural drainage pattern over time. When we turned onto FR 362 that first morning, the lower 3 miles looked exactly as expected. Compacted gravel surface, some washboarding, snow packed to maybe 8 inches with tire tracks from ridgeline vehicles and probably some local hunters. The road climbed gradually along the west side of Trout Creek through second-growth Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, with the creek visible below in a narrow, rocky channel. At roughly mile 3, we reached the earthen berm, or what should have been the earthen berm. The berm was there. I could see its original shape, a mound of compacted fill stretching across the roadbed, maybe 3.5 feet high at the crown and 15 feet wide at the base. But someone had cut a passage through it. Not recently. The cut was clean and deliberate, with the excavated material pushed to either side and graded to create a smooth transition. Vegetation had established in the displaced fill young alders, some snowberry, a few grass clumps now dormant under the snow. Based on the growth, I estimated the cut had been made at least 5 or 6 years earlier, possibly longer. Beyond the cut berm, the decommissioned road continued. And it was clear. I don't mean clear in the sense that someone had recently plowed it. I mean the road surface, while rougher than the maintained section, was navigable. The water bars, which should have been creating perpendicular ridges across the entire road width, had been partially filled, not with the original excavated material, which would have been obvious, but with gravel that appeared to have been hauled in. The 3 culvert removal sites, which should have created impassable gaps at each stream crossing, had been bridged with heavy timber planking, rough-cut logs laid side by side across the gaps, wide enough for a vehicle. Garrett was driving. He stopped the truck at the first bridged crossing and we both got out. Carmen stayed in the cab, logging the GPS coordinates. The timber planks were weathered but solid, probably dug fir, debarked and cut to relatively uniform lengths. They sat on compacted fill on either side of the creek, which was running low beneath them. There were no bolts, no hardware. Gravity and friction held everything in place. It was crude but functional, and it had obviously been there through at least a few seasons. "Someone's maintaining this," Garrett said. He was standing at the edge of the planking, looking at the creek below. I could see what he was seeing. On the upstream side, debris had been cleared from around the timber branches. Leaf litter, the kind of material that accumulates naturally against any obstruction in a watercourse. Someone had cleaned it out, and not long ago. The exposed wood on the upstream faces of the planks was darker where water had reached it. But the upper surfaces showed recent tool marks where accumulated organic material had been scraped away. I took photos. We drove across carefully, confirmed the planking held the weight of the truck without any give, and continued up the road. The second and third crossings were identical timber planked, maintained, recently cleaned. The water bars between crossings had all been partially filled with the same imported gravel. The road surface showed no tire tracks other than our own, but the snow was only 3 or 4 inches deep at this elevation, and any tracks from before the last snowfall would have been covered. We reached our work area around 10 that morning. The section corner where we needed to begin was roughly a quarter-mile off the road, upslope through moderate timber. I set up the base station for our GPS equipment on a point with reasonable sky visibility. and we began the process of locating the original monuments. For the rest of that day and the next two, we focused on the survey work itself. We found 5 of the 7 monuments we were looking for. 2 GLO brass caps were in good position. One had been displaced roughly 8 inches by root action and needed resetting. 2 BLM aluminum caps from the 1978 survey were solid. The remaining 2 monuments, both GLO originals, were missing entirely. Probably buried under decades of organic accumulation or displaced downslope by soil creep. We'd need to re-establish those positions mathematically from the recovered monuments and set new markers. During those 3 days, I kept thinking about the road. It wasn't our concern professionally. Our contract was the boundary survey, and the road's condition was between Ridgeline, the Forest Service, and whoever was doing the work. But I'd been a surveyor in this part of Montana long enough to understand what I was looking at. Someone had invested significant labor and materials in keeping that road passable, not to a high standard, but passable. The earthen berm had been breached with equipment, probably a small excavator or a skid steer. The gravel in the water bars hadn't walked there on its own. The timber planking at the crossings represented dozens of logs, cut, transported, and placed by someone who understood how to bridge a small stream crossing without pouring concrete or driving pilings. And none of it was authorized. Dana confirmed that when I mentioned it to her on the phone Wednesday evening. Ridgeline's easement and special use permit covered vehicle passage on the road as is. They hadn't done any road work, and their permit didn't authorize any. She hadn't even known the upper section was passable until one of her field foresters had driven it the previous fall and reported back that the decommissioned stretch was in surprisingly good shape. "We just figured the Forest Service had done some quiet maintenance," she said. "You're telling me they didn't?" I told her I didn't know, but the work didn't look like Forest Service work. Federal road maintenance, even informal maintenance, follows certain standards. Materials are sourced through approved contracts. Work is documented. The timber planking at those crossings wasn't engineered, it was improvised, competently but informally. And the berm had been breached without any apparent effort to notify the agency that had placed it. Dana said she'd ask her contact at the Superior Ranger District, but she wasn't particularly alarmed. In checkerboard country, she said, people do what they need to do to access their land. It was possible someone with an inholding further up the drainage had simply decided to maintain their own access, rather than go through the permit process. I checked the county plat records that evening at the motel in Superior. There were no private inholdings north of Ridgeline Section 14. Beyond their parcel, the land was entirely Lolo National Forest Sections 22 and 23, both federal, climbing toward the ridge that separated the Trout Creek drainage from the next watershed to the north. FR 362 dead-ended roughly 2 miles past our work area, at what had once been a log landing during the harvest era of the 1970s and 80s. There was nothing up there to access. No cabins, no mining claims, no private parcels. The road went to a clearing in the woods and stopped. We returned on Thursday to continue the monument work. The snow had been light overnight, maybe an inch, and our tracks from the previous day were still partially visible on the decommissioned section. But there was something else. A second set of tire tracks, wider than ours, had been laid down over our outbound tracks from Wednesday afternoon, but under the overnight snow. Someone had driven up the road after we'd left for the day and before the snow began, which the weather station in Superior logged as starting around 11 p.m. The tracks continued past our work area. They went all the way up the road, as far as I could follow them before the new snow obscured the edges. Whoever it was had driven to the end of the road, or at least beyond where we'd been working. I want to be clear about something. Unauthorized use of a decommissioned forest road is a minor federal infraction, not a major crime. People drive on closed roads constantly: hunters, firewood cutters, kids on ATVs. It happens on every national forest in the country, and enforcement is sporadic at best. What caught my attention wasn't the presence of the tracks. It was the pattern. We worked in the area for 3 more days that first week. Every morning, there were fresh tire tracks on the road, made after we'd left and before we'd arrived. Always the same width, always going up. I never saw a vehicle. On the second Friday, Garrett made a comment while we were eating lunch in the truck. "You notice the tracks always go up but never come down." I had noticed. The tire pattern was consistent. The tread was visible on the uphill stretches where the vehicle had been accelerating, and snow compression was deepest. But on the downhill return, the tracks were lighter, sometimes invisible, as if the vehicle had descended very slowly or in a lower gear. But Garrett was right that the directional pattern was odd. On fresh snow, you can usually tell which direction a vehicle was traveling by the spray pattern at the tire edges. Every morning, the spray pattern pointed uphill. The return tracks, such as they were, showed a different character, narrower, more centered, almost as if the vehicle had come back down in its own tracks with extreme precision, or as if only the uphill journey had been made. I didn't like that thought, so I set it aside. The simpler explanation was that the driver was careful, traveling slowly downhill, and the lighter snow compression on the return trip was simply less visible after the overnight accumulation. That's what I told myself. We finished the first phase of the survey work on January 11th. The 2 missing monuments required mathematical reestablishment from the positions of the 5 recovered markers, and I needed to run the calculations back at the office in Missoula before we could set the new brass caps. I estimated we'd return in 2 to 3 weeks for the second phase. During that interval, something changed in how I was thinking about the road. I'd been doing surveys in western Montana since 2014. I'd worked on Forest Service land, BLM land, state trust land, and every configuration of private timber ground the checkerboard could produce. I'd seen unauthorized roads, illegal stream crossings, bootleg gravel pits, and clandestine marijuana grows on federal land. What I hadn't seen was sustained, competent, long-term unauthorized maintenance of a decommissioned federal road that led nowhere. The word "nowhere" is what bothered me. Every unauthorized road I'd ever encountered existed because someone wanted to get to something: a hunting camp, a timber stand, a mining claim, a grow site. FR 362 led to an abandoned log landing in a drainage that had been fully harvested decades ago. The timber up there was 40-year-old second growth, not merchantable for another 20 years at least. There were no structures, no improvements, no reason to drive to the end of that road in January. Unless the reason wasn't at the end of the road. I brought the question to 2 people during the interval. The first was my friend Neil Brandt, who'd worked for the Forest Service as a roads engineer on the Lolo for 22 years before retiring in 2019. I described what I'd found on FR 362 without identifying the specific road or the client. Neil listened, asked a few technical questions about the berm cut and the timber planking, and then said something I didn't expect. How wide were the planks at the crossings? I told him they were roughly 10 to 12 inches in diameter, cut to 8-foot lengths. And you said they weren't bolted or cabled? They weren't. Neil was quiet for a moment. That's not road maintenance, he said. That's access maintenance. Someone's keeping that road open for a specific vehicle, and they don't want the crossings to be permanent because permanent means visible. You bolt those planks down. You cable them. You're telling the Forest Service this is infrastructure. You leave them loose, and if someone with authority shows up, you can pull them in an afternoon, and the crossing goes back to looking decommissioned. The second person I spoke to was Carmen. She'd been quieter than Garrett about the road during our field work, but on the drive back to Missoula after our first week, she'd mentioned something I'd overlooked. At the third stream crossing the highest one, roughly half a mile below the old log landing, she'd noticed that the timber planks were a different species than the first two crossings. The lower crossings used Douglas fir. The upper crossing used western larch. Carmen had worked in materials testing before switching to surveying, and she'd noticed the difference in bark remnants and grain pattern. Two different sources, she said. Somebody cut fir from one stand and larch from another. That's not grabbing whatever's handy. That's selecting. I filed the observation and finished my calculations. On January 28th, we drove back out to set the two new monuments. The road was the same berm cut, water bars filled, crossings planked, fresh tire tracks from the night before. I'd brought a steel tape measure this time, and at the first crossing, I measured the track width at 68 inches, axle to axle. That's consistent with a full-size pickup or a heavy-duty utility vehicle. Not an ATV, not a side-by-side, not a snowmobile. We set the new monuments that day and the next, completing the boundary survey. I should have been done with FR 362 at that point. The contract was fulfilled. Dana had her survey data. Ridgeline could proceed with their timber sale. My professional involvement with that drainage was over. But on our last day, January 29th, I drove past the work area. I told Garrett and Carmen I wanted to see where the road ended. Garrett didn't object. Carmen looked at me but didn't say anything. The road beyond our survey area continued in the same condition, rough but navigable. Water bars filled, surface reasonably graded. After about a mile, the timber transitioned from the younger second growth on Ridgeline's parcel to older trees on the federal sections. The road curved around a side hill and began to descend slightly toward what I knew from the maps was the old log landing. We came around a final bend, and the trees opened up. The landing was a clearing of perhaps 2 acres, roughly oval, at the head of a small side drainage. It was the kind of space the timber industry creates by the thousands, a flat area where logs were decked, sorted, and loaded onto trucks. 40 years of regrowth had softened its edges, but not erased its shape. Young Doug fir and larch crowded the perimeter, and a few pioneer trees, mostly lodgepole, had established in the clearing itself, but it was still recognizably a landing. Snow covered it evenly, maybe 5 inches deep. The tire tracks led into the clearing and stopped. Not at the far edge, not near a turnaround. They stopped roughly in the center of the landing, as if the vehicle had simply parked. There were no additional tracks, no evidence of the vehicle turning around, backing up, or continuing to any other point. The tracks entered from the road, proceeded in a gentle curve toward the middle of the clearing, and ended. I parked at the edge of the landing and got out. Garrett followed. We walked the tracks on foot. They were fresh made the previous night, based on the light dusting of snow that had partially filled them. The tread pattern was the same I'd been seeing all month. At the point where the tracks ended, there was a compressed area consistent with a vehicle being parked, broader snow compression, no directional tread pattern. And beyond that, nothing. No footprints leading away from the vehicle. No evidence of anyone getting out. Just the parked impression in the snow. And then undisturbed snow in every direction for the remaining acre and a half of the clearing. Carmen had stayed in the truck. When we walked back, she was studying something on her phone. She looked up as I opened the door. The snow started at 2 a.m., she said. Weather station logged it. So whoever drove up here did it between when we left yesterday around 4 and 2 in the morning. And then either they left before the snow started and the return tracks got covered, or... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The parked impression was under the 2 a.m. snow, which meant the vehicle had been there before the snow began. But the impression was of a stationary vehicle, not a vehicle in the process of leaving. If the driver had left before 2 a.m., the departure tracks would have been made on bare ground or on the earlier snow layer. They would have been at least partially visible beneath the new accumulation. We'd driven the entire road that morning. There were no departure tracks anywhere on the route. Garrett suggested the driver might have backed down the road in their own inbound tracks, which would explain the absence of a separate set of return tracks. It was physically possible, but practically absurd. FR 362 had no turnarounds on the decommissioned section, backing a full-size truck down 4 miles of winding mountain road in the dark. In winter, in your own tire tracks, with enough precision to leave no visible second impression, that's not driving. That's performance art. I took photographs of the landing, the tracks, and the parked impression. Then we drove down the mountain. And I delivered the completed survey documents to Dana Kowalski the following week. I didn't mention the landing to her. I didn't mention the tracks that went up, but showed no clear return. I delivered the work product, invoiced the contract, and went back to my regular rotation of jobs. February brought a boundary dispute near Drummond and a right-of-way survey for a county road realignment outside Alberton. Normal work, honest work. But in early March, Neil Brandt called me. He'd been thinking about our conversation, he said. He'd made a few calls to people he still knew at the Superior Ranger District, carefully, without mentioning me or the specific road. What he'd learned was this. The district was aware that several decommissioned roads in the Trout Creek drainage showed signs of unauthorized maintenance. It had been noted in at least 2 annual monitoring reports, in 2019 and 2022. Both times, the district had classified the finding as low priority and deferred enforcement action due to staffing constraints. But here's the thing, Neil said. The monitoring notes don't mention the upper section of 362. There are about 2 other roads in the same drainage, both of which dead end at old timber sale boundaries. The district drove those roads, documented the unauthorized work, and moved on. But 362, the one you were on, isn't in either report. It's like they didn't check it. Or like they chose not to. Neil cautioned me against reading too much into that. The Lolo has over 10,000 miles of road in its system, and the Superior Ranger District covers a huge area with limited staff. A decommissioned road that isn't generating complaints doesn't generate attention. There was no conspiracy in the omission. It was just how triage works in an underfunded bureaucracy. I accepted that, but I was also doing something I don't normally do, which is thinking about a job after it's finished. Surveys have clean endpoints. You recover the monuments, run the calculations, set the new markers, deliver the plat, and move on. The land doesn't change because you measured it. But I kept seeing that landing in the snow, the tracks going in, the parked impression, the absolute blankness beyond it. So I went back, March 8th, a Saturday, on my own time, in my own truck. The snow was deeper than it had been in January. March in the Trout Creek drainage is still full winter. The melt doesn't begin in earnest until late April at that elevation, and a series of storms in late February had added another 1.5 feet to the snowpack. I'd brought my snowshoes and a day pack with water, a GPS unit, a camera, and a spare battery. I wasn't planning on anything elaborate. I just wanted to see the landing again, without the obligation of a contract defining where I was supposed to look. I parked at the earthen berm. I didn't want to drive the decommissioned section in a personal vehicle I had no easement, no permit, and no professional reason to be there. Technically, I was trespassing on a closed federal road the moment I walked past the berm cut. I'm stating that plainly because it matters to what I found and how I found it. And I don't want to pretend I was acting in any official capacity. I was a private citizen walking a road he'd been thinking about for 6 weeks. And everything I observed that day was observed without authorization. The road was the same. Berm cut, water bars filled, crossings planked. The snow was undisturbed on the road surface. No tire tracks, no foot tracks, nothing. Whatever vehicle had been making nightly trips in January had either stopped or hadn't visited recently enough to leave marks above the last snowfall, which Superior's weather station placed 3 days earlier. I walked the 4 miles to the landing in about 2 hours, moving steadily but stopping at each stream, crossing to check the planking. At the second crossing, I noticed something I'd missed in January. On the downstream side, below the timber planks, someone had placed rocks in the creek bed. Not randomly, they were arranged in a low line across the channel, roughly 6 inches high, creating a small pool on the upstream side. It wasn't a dam. It was what anyone with stream restoration experience would recognize as a grade control structure. A simple rock weir designed to prevent the creek from cutting downward at the point where the crossing had altered the natural stream bed gradient. Whoever had built the timber crossings understood that removing the original culverts had changed the stream's behavior at those points, and they'd installed a low-tech correction. That was the detail that shifted something in my thinking. Breaching a berm is crude work. Filling water bars with gravel is labor. Planking a crossing with logs is practical engineering. But installing grade control in the stream below your improvised crossing, that's not someone keeping a road open for convenience. That's someone managing a watershed. I reached the landing around noon. The clearing looked different under the deeper snow, smoother, more uniform. The young trees at the margins reduced to snow-covered shapes. I walked to the approximate center, where I'd seen the parked vehicle impression in January. The snow was even and unbroken. No tracks, no impressions, no sign anyone had been here since the last storm. I walked the perimeter of the landing. On the far side, away from the road entrance, the clearing narrowed into what had once been a skid trail, just a rough path where logs had been dragged from the cutting units to the landing by heavy equipment. The skid trail climbed the slope to the northeast, visible as a slightly depressed line in the snow between the trees. I followed it. 50 yards up the skid trail, the trees thickened and the trail became harder to distinguish. The slope steepened. I was in older timber now. Doug fir and western larch, some of it clearly pre-harvest based on the diameter. Trees that had been left as seed stock or were too difficult to access when the unit was cut in the 70s. The canopy was heavier, and less snow had reached the ground. I could see the forest floor in patches of duff, needles, some exposed rock. At roughly 100 yards from the landing, I found the first cairn. It was small, 5 rocks stacked deliberately on a flat-topped boulder at the edge of the skid trail. The rocks were local, the same metamorphic schist that outcrops throughout the Trout Creek drainage. They'd been selected for flat surfaces and stacked with care, the largest on the bottom, the smallest on top. Snow had been on them and melted. The surfaces were damp. And the lichen on the boulder around the base of the cairn was pressed flat where meltwater had pooled. Cairns in the backcountry are common. Hikers build them, hunters build them, bored kids build them. A single cairn on an old skid trail means nothing by itself. But this one was placed precisely at the point where the skid trail intersected a barely visible game path that contoured across the slope to the west. Without the cairn, I'd have walked straight past the junction. With it, the turn was obvious. I followed the game path. It traversed the hillside through the older timber, maintaining a roughly level contour while the slope fell away below and rose above. The footing was uneven but manageable in snowshoes. After roughly 300 yards, I found a second cairn, this one at a point where the game path split one branch continuing the contour, the other dropping steeply toward the creek below. The cairn was on the uphill side, marking the contour route. I was being led somewhere. I understood that clearly, and I want to be honest about my decision-making. I could have turned around. I was on federal land without authorization, alone, in winter, following a series of rock stacks placed by an unknown person into terrain I hadn't scouted. Every principle of backcountry safety and professional judgment told me to go back. I kept walking. The third cairn appeared after another 200 yards, at a point where the game path crossed a small seasonal drainage dry in winter, just a crease in the slope filled with rocks and old leaves. On the far side of the drainage, the forest changed. The larch and fir gave way to a stand of mature western red cedar, a pocket of old growth in a drainage bottom, the kind of microsite that holds moisture and stays cool enough to support cedar even on the drier east side of the Bitterroots. The trees were large, some of them 3 feet in diameter, and the canopy was dense enough to have kept the ground nearly snow-free. The light dropped. The air felt different, heavier, wetter, resinous. Among the cedars, roughly 30 yards from the drainage crossing, I found the structure. It wasn't a cabin. It wasn't a shelter in any sense I'd use professionally. It was a platform, a flat, elevated surface, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, built of peeled logs and standing about 3 feet off the ground on 6 vertical posts. The construction was the same general character as the stream crossings on FR 362. Unbolted, unpinned, held together by gravity and careful joinery. The logs were western larch, debarked and weathered to a gray finish that suggested they'd been in place for years. The platform surface was solid. I tested it with my hand, pressing down, and the posts showed no rot at the base, which meant whoever built this had selected rot-resistant wood and placed the posts on flat rocks rather than setting them directly in the soil. There was nothing on the platform. No gear, no containers, no signs of habitation. But the platform was clean. The surface had been swept or brushed recently enough that the thin layer of cedar scale and debris you'd expect under a dense canopy was absent. The bare wood was exposed, dry, almost polished in appearance. I stood there for a long time. The cedars blocked most of the wind. The only sound was the faint movement of branches high in the canopy and the distant murmur of Trout Creek somewhere below. The platform sat in the middle of the cedar grove like a table set for a meal no one had ordered, in a room no one was supposed to know about. At the end of a road the government had officially closed 28 years ago. I photographed it from every angle. I measured it with my tape, 7 feet 9 inches by 9 feet 11 inches. Platform height, 34 inches. I checked the joinery. The logs were notched at each intersection, saddle-notched, the way you'd build a log structure if you'd done it before. The notches were cut with a chainsaw. I could see the kerf marks, but finished with a hand tool, probably an adze or a draw knife. The posts were set plumb. Whoever built this knew what they were doing with wood. Under the platform, the ground was bare and dry. I crouched to look. In the center, Directly beneath the platform surface, someone had placed a flat stone, maybe 18 inches square, naturally flat, not cut. On the stone sat a glass jar, a mason jar, quart size, with a metal lid. Through the glass, I could see something inside. Paper. I did not touch the jar. I want to be explicit about that. I photographed it in place from multiple angles, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the contents through the glass. The paper inside appeared to be a single folded sheet, and through the curved glass, I could make out handwriting on the visible surface. The writing was in pencil, and the curvature of the glass made it difficult to read. But I could make out a few fragments. A date what appeared to be October 2023. Several lines of text in a small controlled hand. And near the bottom of the visible portion, a sequence of numbers that looked like coordinates. I backed out from under the platform and stood up. My GPS unit was in my pack. I checked my current position. The coordinates were consistent with what I'd expect for this drainage, well within the federal sections north of Ridgeline's parcel. Then I did something I'd been avoiding, which was think about what I was looking at as a complete picture rather than a series of individual observations. Someone had breached a decommissioned forest road's closure berm. They had filled the water bars, planked the stream crossings, installed grade control structures in the creeks, and maintained all of it over a period of years. They had driven to the end of that road regularly, in winter, at night. They had marked a route from the old log landing through the forest to a cedar grove that didn't appear on any map I'd seen. And in that grove, they had built a platform and left a jar containing a written document. None of this was sinister. I need to say that because the accumulation of details can start to feel ominous in a way that the individual facts don't support. Unauthorized road maintenance is a civil infraction. Building an unpermitted structure on federal land is a misdemeanor. Leaving a jar under a platform is nothing at all. Each element, taken alone, had an ordinary explanation. But taken together, they described a sustained, deliberate, skilled project by someone who had chosen the most inaccessible location in the drainage and invested years of effort in maintaining access to it without being detected. I hiked back to my truck. The walk down took about an hour and 40 minutes. I drove home to Missoula and spent the evening looking at maps, aerial imagery, and the land ownership records I'd already reviewed for the Ridgeline contract. Nothing had changed. The Cedar Grove sat on Section 22, federal land, Lolo National Forest. No claims, no permits, no special use authorizations that I could find in the public records. On Monday, I called Neil Brandt again. I described the platform without telling him exactly where it was. He listened carefully. You said the posts were set on stones, not in the ground. On flat rocks, yes. And no fasteners, no bolts, no spikes? None that I could see. That's deliberate, he said. If you bolt a structure together, it's a structure. If you stack it, it's a pile of logs. Someone who understands how the Forest Service classifies unauthorized improvements would know the difference. A pile of logs isn't a structure in the regs. It's material. You can take enforcement action against a structure. Material, you just ask them to remove it. I asked Neil if he'd ever encountered anything like this during his time with the agency. He said he'd found unauthorized hunting camps, old mining cabins that nobody claimed, a few religious or ceremonial sites that various groups maintained without permits. But a platform, maintained and empty, at the end of a closed road? No. What's on it? He asked. Nothing, I told him. It's clean. That's what's strange. Nothing's the strangest thing you can find in the woods, Neil said. Everything else has a story that explains it eventually. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to find the story that explained it. I was working other jobs during the day, a subdivision plat near Frenchtown, a fence line survey for a rancher outside Helmville, but in the evenings, I was doing the kind of research I normally do only when a boundary dispute goes to court, and I need historical context for a property line. County records, timber sale archives, old Forest Service environmental assessments. What I found was thin but suggestive. The Trout Creek drainage had been heavily logged between 1971 and 1989 under a series of timber sales administered by the Superior Ranger District. The checkerboard ownership meant that federal sections and Plum Creek sections were harvested in an alternating pattern, with the two landowners sharing the road system by agreement. FR 362 had been built in 1973 to access the upper drainage, and it had been maintained jointly by the Forest Service and Plum Creek through the harvest period. When the last sale closed in 1989, maintenance responsibility reverted entirely to the Forest Service, and with no further timber program to justify the road's existence, it was placed on the decommissioning list. The 1997 decommissioning work was contracted to a local earth-moving company based in St. Regis. The contract file, which I obtained through a records request to the Lolo National Forest Supervisor's Office, identified the contractor as Halleck Excavation. The work had been completed in September 1997 and signed off by the district's roads engineer, a name I didn't recognize. Halleck Excavation. I looked them up. The company had been dissolved in 2003, according to Montana Secretary of State records. The registered agent was Donald Halleck, with a mailing address in St. Regis. A search of the St. Regis phone directory, there's still a printed one. This is a small town, showed no current listing for Donald Halleck. But there was a listing for M. Halleck at a different address. I drove to St. Regis on a Wednesday evening in late March. It's about an hour west of Missoula on I-90, a town of roughly 300 people at the confluence of the St. Regis River and the Clark Fork. The address for M. Halleck was a small frame house on a side street north of the highway, well maintained, with a late model Subaru in the driveway and a detached garage with the door closed. A woman answered the door. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, gray-haired, direct in the way that people in small Montana towns tend to be with strangers. I introduced myself as a land surveyor, told her I'd been working in the Trout Creek drainage, and asked if she was related to Donald Halleck of Halleck Excavation. Don was my husband, she said. He passed in 2009. I told her I was sorry. I explained that I'd come across some road work in the drainage that I was trying to understand, and that her husband's company had done the original decommissioning on FR 362 in 1997. I asked if she knew anything about the road's history. Margaret Halleck. She told me her first name as she invited me into the kitchen was cautious but not unfriendly. She made coffee while I explained what I'd found. The breached berm, the filled water bars, the planked crossings. I didn't mention the platform or the cairns. I wanted to see what she'd offer on her own. Don did a lot of decom work for the Forest Service in the 90s, she said. They were pulling roads out all over the Lolo. He said it felt wrong, tearing out what they'd spent 20 years building. But the contracts paid well and the work was steady. I asked if he'd ever mentioned FR 362 specifically. She thought about it. He mentioned Trout Creek. I remember that because he said it was a shame about the cedars. I set my coffee down. What cedars? There was a stand of old cedar up one of the side drainages. Big trees, he said. He'd found them while he was working the road, walked up from the landing on his lunch break. He said they were the biggest cedar he'd seen on the east side of the divide, and that nobody seemed to know they were there. He talked about reporting them to the Forest Service getting them into some kind of protection status, but I don't think he ever did. I asked her when he'd found them. It would have been during the road job, September of '97. Margaret didn't know anything about the road being maintained after the decommissioning. She seemed genuinely surprised when I described the condition of the crossings and the berm. But she told me one more thing before I left. After Don's excavation business closed in 2003, he'd continued to do occasional private work, small jobs, driveways, pond construction, the kind of thing a man with equipment does in rural Montana to stay busy. And every fall, usually in October, he'd take his old skid steer up to Trout Creek and be gone for a day. He told her it was firewood cutting. She'd never questioned it. He always came back before dark, and he never brought any firewood. I asked him about it once, she said. This was maybe 2006 or 2007. He just said he was checking on something. I figured it was a hunting spot he didn't want to share. Don Halleck died of a heart attack in January 2009. Margaret sold his equipment that spring: the skid steer, a small excavator, a dump trailer. She didn't remember who bought the skid steer. I drove back to Missoula in the dark, and I sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. The cedars were the connection. Don Halleck had found that grove in 1997, recognized it as something exceptional, and apparently spent the next 12 years maintaining access to it. The road work, the berm breach, the filled water bars, the planked crossings could have been his, at least initially. He had the equipment, the skills, and the intimate knowledge of the road's construction, having built and then unbuilt it himself. The larch planking at the upper crossing even made sense, and a man working alone with a chainsaw would use whatever timber was closest to each crossing site. And the species distribution in the drainage would put larch higher and fir lower. But Don Halleck had been dead for 16 years, and someone was still driving that road in January 2025. I went back to the records. Garrett helped me this time. He pulled the equipment sale records from Margaret's estate filings. She'd declared the sales as income, so they were documented. The skid steer, a Bobcat S175, had been sold to an individual named R. Kelso, address in Plains, Montana. Plains is about 40 miles north of St. Regis, still in the Clark Fork drainage, a small timber community in Sanders County. Garrett found a current address for R. Kelso, Russell Kelso, on a rural route outside Plains. We didn't visit. I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore, professionally or otherwise. This had stopped being a survey question weeks earlier. I wasn't looking for a boundary or a monument or a right-of-way. I was looking for a person, and I didn't have a professional reason to find them. It was Carmen who made the next connection. She'd been following my research peripherally. I'd been talking about it in the office, probably more than I should have, and one morning in early April, she came in with a printout from the Montana Natural Heritage Program's database. She'd searched for documented old-growth western red cedar stands on the east side of the Bitterroot Divide in Mineral County. There were none. 0 recorded occurrences. Western red cedar is common on the wet west side of the divide, in the drainages that flow toward Idaho. But on the east side, the side facing the Clark Fork, it's rare enough that individual stands of mature trees are considered significant ecological features. The stand I'd found in the Trout Creek drainage, if it was as old and as large as it appeared, would be a notable discovery, the kind of thing that would interest researchers, conservation groups, and the Forest Service itself, and the kind of thing that Don Halleck might have wanted to protect by keeping it quiet. Carmen had found something else. In the Heritage Program's database, there was a single entry from 2011. 2 years after Don's death, flagging an unverified report of mature thuja plicata in the upper Trout Creek drainage, submitted anonymously through the program's public reporting form. The entry included approximate coordinates that, when I plotted them, fell within 300 yards of where I'd found the platform. The report had never been field verified. The program's notes indicated that a site visit had been planned for the summer of 2012, but had been canceled due to budget constraints and never rescheduled. Someone had known about the cedars after Don died. Someone had tried to get them officially documented. And when the system failed to follow through, that someone had apparently continued what Don had started: maintaining the road, maintaining access, maintaining whatever the platform represented in relation to those trees. In mid-April, as the snow began to recede in the lower elevations, I made a decision. I contacted the Superior Ranger District directly. I didn't file a complaint or a report. I called the district office and asked to speak with someone responsible for botany or special forest products. I was transferred to a woman named Erin Tanaka, who held the title of district botanist, though she told me her actual responsibilities covered everything from noxious weed treatment to archaeological site clearance. I told her I was a surveyor who'd been working in the Trout Creek drainage and that I'd observed what appeared to be a significant old-growth cedar stand on federal land in Section 22. I gave her the approximate coordinates. I did not mention the road, the platform, the cairns, or the jar. I framed it as a professional observation made incidentally during authorized survey work, which was true as far as it went. Erin was interested. She said she wasn't aware of any documented cedar stands in that part of the drainage, but that the topography and aspect were consistent with the kind of sheltered microsite that could support cedar on the east side. She asked if I could send her my coordinates and any photographs. I sent her the GPS data and the photos of the trees themselves. Not the platform, not the jar. She emailed back 2 days later. She'd checked the Heritage Program database and found the same 2011 unverified report Carmen had located. She said she'd add a site visit to her summer field schedule, probably in July or August, when access was easier and her workload allowed it. I waited. May passed, then June. I worked other contracts. The Trout Creek drainage stayed in the back of my mind the way an unresolved survey discrepancy stays, not urgent, but not settled, a line that doesn't close. In early July, Erin Tanaka emailed me. She'd visited the site. The cedar stand was real and significant. She estimated 12 to 15 mature trees, the largest exceeding 36 inches in diameter at breast height, in a drainage microsite that showed all the characteristics of a long-term refugium. She was recommending it for formal documentation and potential research natural area designation, which would afford it the highest level of administrative protection available on a national forest. She also mentioned, in a brief final paragraph, that she'd found evidence of prior visitation at the site, including what she described as a raised log platform that appeared to have been constructed without authorization. She'd flagged it for the district's law enforcement officer, but noted that the structure appeared to be of long standing and was not causing environmental damage. Her tone was matter-of-fact. An unauthorized structure in the woods is a Tuesday for a Forest Service botanist. She did not mention a jar. I read that email several times. Then I called her. We spoke for about 15 minutes. I asked about the platform, and she confirmed it was the same structure I'd described. She said it was well built and clean, and that it didn't appear to be associated with any camping, habitation, or resource extraction. I asked if she'd found anything else at the site. Like what? She asked. I hesitated. Then I described the jar I'd seen in March, the mason jar under the platform, on the flat stone, containing a folded sheet of paper. There was a pause. There was no jar when I visited, she said. I looked under the platform specifically because the construction was unusual. The stone was there, but there was nothing on it. Someone had removed the jar between March and July. That's where the investigation ended. Functionally. Erin Tanaka did what the system is designed to do. She documented the cedar stand, initiated the designation process, and reported the unauthorized structure. The Forest Service, in turn, began the administrative steps toward research natural area status, which would eventually bring more eyes to that drainage than it had seen in decades. The road would be examined. The unauthorized maintenance would be addressed. The platform would probably be dismantled, or the builder would be found and asked to remove it. The system worked, not because I forced it to, and not because it had failed before. It worked because someone, Erin, did her job when given the information, and the information only reached her because someone else, decades earlier, had cared enough about those cedars to build a road to them, and keep building it, even after the government tore it down. I never identified who continued the work after Don Halleck died. Russell Kelso, the man who bought Don's skid steer, is a real person living outside Plains, Montana. I don't know if he's the one who maintained the road, built the platform, placed the cairns, submitted the anonymous Heritage Program report in 2011, or drove to that landing in January. I didn't pursue it further. The cedars were going to be protected through legitimate channels now. And whoever had been maintaining that access had arguably accomplished exactly what they'd set out to do, keeping the grove reachable until someone with authority could be made to see it. But I still think about the jar. Not its contents. I never read what was written on that paper. And now I probably never will. What I think about is the fact that it was there in March and gone in July. Someone visited the platform during that interval and took the jar. Maybe it was the same person who'd been driving the road all winter. Maybe they'd been leaving messages there for years. In a glass jar under a platform in an old-growth cedar grove at the end of a road the government closed in 1997. And this time, they decided the message was no longer needed. Because the cedars had been found, not by the person who'd been tending them, but through the same system that person had worked around for years. Erin Tanaka's visit in July meant the grove would be cataloged, measured, studied, and designated. Official protection would replace the unofficial kind, the breached berms and filled water bars and timber planking, and stone weirs and cairns, and clean platforms that had constituted one person's private conservation program for what might have been a quarter century. The jar's removal could mean many things. It could mean the message had been retrieved because its purpose was fulfilled. It could mean the builder learned about the official interest and decided to erase signs of their involvement before it was traced. It could mean something else entirely that I haven't considered. Garrett asked me once, late in the spring, what I thought the platform was for. I told him I didn't know. It wasn't a shelter, it was open to the sky. It wasn't a cache, there was nothing stored on it. It wasn't a blind. There was no game trail within sight. The best I could manage was that it was a place. Someone had built a place in the cedars, and they'd maintained it carefully, and they'd kept it clean, and they'd visited it in winter when the snow made every trip a declaration of purpose. Carmen had a different take. She said the platform reminded her of something from a forestry textbook, a monitoring station. A flat, elevated surface where you could place instruments, spread maps, or simply sit at a consistent height above the forest floor and observe the surrounding trees from a fixed vantage point. If someone wanted to track the health of a cedar grove over years, to watch for disease or wind damage or changes in the canopy, a permanent platform at a consistent height would be a practical tool. I like Carmen's explanation. It accounts for the construction, the maintenance, and the location. It doesn't account for the winter visits, or the jar, or the fact that whoever built it chose to do so in secret rather than simply reporting the grove to the Forest Service and letting the professionals handle it. But maybe that's the part I understand best. Don Halleck was the man the Forest Service hired to tear out a road in 1997. He found a grove of ancient cedars at the end of that road, and he knew that reporting them would bring attention to a place that had survived precisely because no one was paying attention. So he kept the road alive instead. He maintained it the way you maintain a promise, steadily, without recognition, on your own time. And when he died, someone else picked up the work. That's the part that takes this beyond anything I can resolve with survey data or public records. One person's private commitment to an unmarked grove of old trees became, somehow, transferable. The knowledge passed. The effort continued. The road stayed open. I drove past the Trout Creek turnoff last month on my way to a job near Lookout Pass. The county road heading north looked the same. Somewhere up that drainage, the Forest Service is processing the paperwork that will formally recognize what Don Halleck recognized in a lunch break in September 1997. And somewhere, maybe in Plains, maybe in St. Regis, maybe somewhere else entirely, there's a person who spent years keeping a road alive for a stand of trees, who built a platform in a cedar grove and swept it clean, who drove 4 miles of closed road in the dark in January to sit in a clearing in the snow for reasons I don't have the right to guess at. I'm a surveyor. I find lines and corners. I mark the edges of things. What happened on FR 362 doesn't have edges I can mark. The road was closed. Someone opened it. The cedars were hidden. Someone found them. The system forgot. Someone remembered. The only thing I still want to know is what was written on that paper.